Hello everybody. I would like to add my welcome to the webinar. I'd also like to thank Paul for the promotion that he gave me in introducing me. I was not in fact the head of the Scottish Investment Bank, as Kerry Sharp, who is the head of the Investment Bank, will know well. I was the head of a fund, one of the many funds that the Investment Bank runs, and that fund was the Renewable Energy Investment Fund. I'd also like to advise everybody that the number of countries represented on the webinar is truly amazing. It covers most of the world. Some parts of the world you would kind of expect to be represented. UK, Ireland, France, Canada, of course, but there are many other areas represented, and the spread of folk across the world really speaks to the extent of the sector. I would also like to thank Paul and the ITES team for putting this webinar together. Of course, the three panelists, myself, Cameron Smith of Atlantis, and Mark Stewart of JCCA, will take all the credit if it goes well, and we'll make sure that Paul and his team take all the blame if there are any hitches. But we will all be there in London, 14th, 15th November, and hope to see you. Okay, without further ado, I'd like to get on with the slides. The format for today to run through a few slides and then to have a panel session at the end, and in that panel session we will take questions that you can lodge during the discussion section. The questions can be raised by email using the discussion box that Paul was referring to earlier. So I will now kick off by getting the slide pack moving. So the webinar will consist of 14 slides, and you'll be glad to know that the one in front of you now is the third of these. So the starting point for the session is the MeyGen project, and you know there are two slides on that, and they will give a high-level view of how that was put together at the time, and how that might inform our discussions today. And then there's 4 slides covering this post-MeyGen era, this era that we're in. I think it's important that we identify, try to understand what this era is. Now, we're fortunate to have Cameron Smith with us, and when I finish the slides, Cameron will give us an update on the MeyGen project, but he will also reference the contrast between the two ocean energy sectors that he has experience of, offshore wind and tidal, and see if there's any helpful learnings in there. And in that same post-slide discussion, my colleague Mark Stewart from JCCA will reference his own experience that sits around the project financing of major infrastructure projects, the preparation of teasers, of INs, of financial plans and financial models, and how perhaps professionalizing those documents and approaching the fundraise in that way might assist some projects. And then we'll finish off with 5 slides on what all of that means for funding tidal projects now. So the first of 2 slides on MeyGen 1A. Now, what I want to make clear is that this was the situation, this slide and the next, when MeyGen 1A was first funded. The project, of course, has moved on considerably. The financing and the structure will be very different now, but this is how it was at the time, and I think it's informative. the first point to make is that MeyGen, as we discuss it here, MeyGen Way is a standalone, ring-fenced, 4-turbine, 6-megawatt project. Often described by Tim Cornelius as the hardest 6 megawatts that's ever been done. But the important thing to note here is that it always had the possibility of being a 300 megawatt power station at sea. That possibility was always there. The first close was £52 million in September 2014. That was made up of the Crown Estate, who did a £10 million debt-like product, effectively debt. Now, I think it's important that we record my views, at least on the reasons that they were all involved. Crown Estate, in my view, needed to preserve and enhance the value of their seabed rights. The whole programme for tidal energy projects, for ocean energy projects generally, was stalling. And they came up with an innovative way of trying to encourage that sector. And the MeyGen project was the beneficiary of that. Then REEF, the Renewable Energy Investment Fund, which is a Scottish enterprise fund operated by the Scottish Investment Bank, which is part of Scottish Enterprise, a fund of £103 million in total, which came from the Scottish Government share of the UK fossil fuel levy, £10 million of debt. That was effectively a match for the Crown Estate, and the reasons for REEF getting involved were clearly to seek wins for Scotland PLC, and those wins look like supply chain jobs, supply chain work, the anchoring of a potential new industry in Scotland, expertise, and yes, the potential of upside. DEC put a £10 million grant in, and in my view, their interest was in establishing a new industrial sector. High put grants in, and again, High, for those who are not familiar with the setup in Scotland, is one of the 2 economic intervention agencies in the country. Scottish Enterprise is the other one, and the 2 organisations operate very much together. There is a geographical split, so Highlands and Islands Enterprise operates in the north of Scotland typically, and Scottish Enterprise in the south. In certain areas, and REEF, Renewable Energy Investment Fund, was one of those. They operate together. So REEF was a pan-Scotland fund. So their interest was again in getting businesses based in Scotland, in their area, and in enhancing and developing infrastructure around marine projects. Atlantis themselves provided equity. And again, I think it's interesting to remember that Atlantis were originally a turbine developer, a turbine technology developer, and became a project developer through this process. And REEF also puts in matching equity. So that was the financial structure as it was at that time. So the actual corporate structure, and again, I would stress this was as it was at the time, and will not reflect the structure now, but again, it's informative, I believe. So REEF and Atlantis put in equity into a company that was created during the course of the funding, Tidal Power Scotland. That was done actually for various structural reasons. Initially, the discussions were started off, but actually it became a real good focus for potentially taking the industry forward in ways that we had originally thought of when we thought of creating that entity. REEF was put in, hence the linkage to the MeyGen company itself. High grant, debt grant, and Crown debt. So that was the structure at that time, and that's the background against which we're looking at the MeyGen project as informative for our discussions today. Okay.
Can I ask you, why do we have so many different speakers?
We talk about the post-MeyGen era.
We just want to demonstrate
I think to remember that MeyGen is still very much an ongoing project, and Cameron will speak about that, as I've said, post the slides. The world record generation announced last week, so it's very much a live project, and the OPEX phase is very much underway, and there's learnings going on there. And one of the things for this group on this webinar is whether that ongoing OPEX phase and that ongoing delivery of MeyGen, and indeed the morphing of Atlantis into what's now delivering in other parts of the world, represents opportunity for the sector. Now that's a matter to be thought of. I'm sure many of you are thinking about that, but something to bear in mind. In the post-MeyGen area, it's also important, I think, to consider what the players who funded first time around are doing now, because as with all raises, your first and best route to raising more money is your existing investors. So what are those original players doing? Well, Reef, I left this first investment bank in June 2016, and at that time, the remit for Reef, what it was going to do, was under review. Now, I have no insight or inside knowledge into what's happening now, and my understanding is Reef is very much open for business, but the process of review and what it may concentrate on is an ongoing one. I am, however, happy to speculate, and this is not informed in any way speculation, it's simply my own speculation, that some of the drivers as to what we may concentrate on may be outlined in the current Scottish Government energy strategy. That strategy, I think, is very innovative and very ambitious. Time will tell whether that's correct or not. County State, of course, has been restructured.
Andrew, sorry to interrupt you. We can hear two voices coming from your microphone. There seems to be a female female voice on the line.
I apologise for that. I apologise to everybody. I can hear the same voice, but I can assure you it's not coming from here. There's only two people in the room that I'm delivering this from. So I do apologise, but it's not coming from here.
Okay, let me have a look. I think it's calmed down. No. Okay, carry on. Sorry about that.
I do apologise to everybody on the webinar for that. And as I trailed at the outset, that's obviously false law, nothing to do with me. So what are the players doing? The Crown Estate has been restructured, and Crown Estate Scotland has been established. Now, I think it's probably widely known that Crown Estate Scotland simply doesn't have the level of resource that the Crown Estate generally have. Crown Estate as a complete organisation, it's unknown to me whether they have appetite to fund. I would speculate that they don't. I would speculate that they're not in that market now. DEC, of course, is now based, and the industrial strategy has emerged as the hook upon which much support may be hung. There are some detailed ongoing discussions between the industry and BATES, and I would give a name check to Christoph Harwood, who's doing a lot of work on behalf of the industry, and for those of you who are aware of that work, there was an update provided by him to the sector generally, but for those of you who are not part of that update, that really does involve the industry making a case to particularly UK ministers and MPs and others that the tidal sector in particular, the marine sector generally, has a lot to offer that it can deliver for UK on a number of fronts, and it is worthy.
I've just messaged
I am sorry, I'm still continuing to hear the background chat, and I don't know why that is, but I'll carry on. I hope it's not too distracting for people.
I know.
Amazon's enterprise continues to seek economic gains for the High Region and continues to...
Andrew, sorry to interrupt. I just want to double check. On my system, it says that you've got two devices on, and I just want to make sure both of them are in your room.
Robin does have anything.
Yes, they are both in my room. I am on this laptop, and my colleague Cameron Smith is on as well.
And there's nothing else.
Well, I mean,
with
yeah, I mean,
devices could be connected to. Okay.
she said that there were 4 people who were booked in.
Oh, there's nothing else on this end.
Okay.
So each of them, I think one of them is already.
Okay, never mind. We'll carry on for now.
There hasn't been any work.
Atlantis, of course, continues to grow, diversify, develop, and very publicly is, of course, seeking to deliver ocean energy projects across the world and use the expertise it has gained in the MeyGen project to deliver those projects. So all of the players, in one way or another, have developed since the original MeyGen project first closing.
From there, but we're also preparing some
technology development has also continued, of course, and not least the technology associated with the MeyGen project itself. I've name-checked 1 or 2 of the developers who are making progress there, but there will be others, and those I've not name-checked, and I apologise for. So Scott Renewables, of course, Nova, Minesto, Shottle, Open Hydro, are all making progress. And as happened with Atlantis, some developers are developing, some technology developers are developing their own sites so that they have a pipeline of projects to deliver. DP Energy, for whom I worked, have tidal sites across the world, including the Bay of Fundy in Canada. And Atlantis, as I've said, are leveraging their skills to look for other sites. So potentially the pipeline of sites is growing. Obviously there's a French tidal round as well coming up, which offers further pipeline possibilities, bearing in mind the challenges that sit around doing business in France and getting good French partners to help you with that. Obviously, UK government support has changed and changed those of us in the industry, say, quite dramatically. I referenced the work that's going on under the strategy to engage with the UK government, and I'm sure all of you are having various engagements there, and obviously they are to be encouraged. Brexit obviously limps along. There are some useful and helpful guides around what that might mean. We're all looking for help there. My understanding is that the MPs, as they gather again in Westminster, are going to get an update. I'm sure we'll get one too. Scottish Enterprise has a very good 12-point plan for how you might want to deal with Brexit. There is help out there, and I would encourage you to access that. Offshore wind, I think, is another really interesting area for tidal and funding tidal and lessons. And Cameron is going to speak a little bit about that later on, and I would encourage those of you who have questions in that area to address them to him. He has a lot of experience there. But one of the most talked about lessons from offshore wind for tidal is the costs of delivering offshore wind and the pace at which they have reduced. I think it's fair to say that nobody, not even the most optimistic offshore wind developer, would have believed how quickly the costs have fallen. Now, for me, that is a double-edged sword for the tidal sector. On the one hand, it demonstrates to investors how quickly the costs can be driven down when an industry gets scale. Clearly there are lessons in that from other industries in the past, but this is a live, up-to-date lesson from exactly the same challenging sector. But also it represents a challenge because I think there's no doubt that those investing will be using the cost of producing energy from offshore wind as a baseline. Now, there are differences, of course, because when the power is produced is relevant. Power is produced offshore, obviously, when the wind blows. Tidal energy is very predictable, and it's very predictable for a very long time. and that has a value in itself. But nevertheless, it's undoubtedly the case, and I've been in meetings where it's happened. Investors will use that as some form of benchmark. The other positive out of offshore wind for me, for our sector, is that appetites for funders, appetites for financiers, for ocean energy projects have been whetted a bit. Relatively speaking, only a small number of investors have been able to get a good position in offshore wind. So there is pent-up demand, but that pent-up demand to deploy finance into ocean energy projects is obviously for bankable projects and bankable technologies. That demand now understands a little more about the benefits of engaging early with the sector, and the doors may be slightly more ajar, but you still have to get everything right before you'll have success. The supply chain has gained some confidence that ocean energy is real, and that it is worthwhile spending some time and effort in getting into that area. And again, I think Cameron will mention supply chain specifically. For me, floating wind teaches some lessons to tidal. It shows diversification of oil majors. So Statoil and Masdar, Statoil sold 25% of their high wind project to Masdar. Shows that the oil majors are ready to diversify. Total, of course, have publicly announced that they need approximately 20% of their energy generation from renewables by around 2020. So there are some majors who are looking for other forms of generation, and they will include ocean energy. Now, the extent to which they include tidal energy is debatable, but you can begin at least conversations with them. These majors, in my personal view, do not want to be designers of technology. What they want to be is purchasers of proven and bankable technology. So in my view, when you see Statoil developing the high wind project, and this is a personal view, you see an oil major that wants to see a market in equipment, and is helping that market to get underway. Now, floating wind provides us with some warning signs, of course. The Dunray Tribe project is having its travails at the moment, and I sincerely hope that that project does end up getting delivered. So there are some negatives too around those lessons. And one thing I want to mention in the connection with offshore wind are the Scottish Government good principles for offshore renewables. For long and weary, the Scottish Government has been pushing hard to get the onshore wind sector to deliver meaningful community benefit, but also meaningful community ownership and shared ownership in projects. And that is something that I know the Scottish Government holds dear to its ambitions. And I think those principles should be looked to by the tidal sector too. I have reservations about exposing communities to shared ownership in tidal projects that sits around the risk, but nevertheless, I believe involving communities is a really good move, and maybe that's something that we could get into a little bit in the discussion area. Finally, in the post-MeyGen area, we're dealing with new funds and new funding streams that have developed since the MeyGen first close. So, in my view, Ocean Energy Europe has done a great job in lobbying for the inclusion of tidal energy in the new ETS Innovation Fund. Summer report on that was published 12th June this year. If anybody wants access to that report, it's freely available on the web. I can certainly send it if you wish to get it. And there's a rump of NER funding as well from the existing pot. UK public sector, I've referenced REEF already, and that's looking at its role. And there's a new Scottish growth scheme fund. Now, I'm not saying that fund will fund tidal energy projects, because I simply don't know, and it may be out with remit. But nevertheless, there's new funds happening all the time, and in the private sector, I'm aware of two funds emerging in Scotland. One of which I'm helping directly on, and the other which I'm aware of. And they will have money, and it is possible that the tidal energy sector will be within remit. And obviously the emergence of green bonds represents a positive development, and once again we can look to Atlantis, who have led in that area, certainly in the UK, and to my knowledge anywhere else in the world, with the recent raise they worked on with abundance. Okay, so what I would like to do now is talk about the actual funding of tidal projects and come up with some, perhaps some more hard-edged advice around all of that. I've got five slides on that, and what these slides are intended to narrate is some learnings from my own involvement with a number of projects and pitches, funding discussions over the last 5 years or so, and cover some high-level thoughts to bear in mind as you go forward with your projects. And then the slides will go on to look at what you can do to create the right conditions to achieve and secure funding in your project and your technology or your business. And finally have a look at the pitch preparation and finish with some final thoughts. I mentioned earlier on that some of the work that sits around the engagement in the United Kingdom with Westminster government positions the marine sector as an offer and not as an ask, as a solution to some of the challenges that sit around climate change, energy security, the creation of economic activity, particularly at the geographic margins of Europe. And I think it's good to bear that in mind when you are going and speaking to people and when you are designing your asks. You're seeking funding. To that extent, clearly it's an ask. But when you're dealing with public sector funds, particularly in public sector bodies, you are offering solutions also. There are lessons from abroad. There are things that other countries, Canada in particular, are doing, which I think we can learn from. Narrative, for me, is really important. In my very short time in the market as a consultant, only a few weeks, I have looked at a number of teasers, I've looked at a number of IMs, and I have noted that the story, the narrative that they tell, almost never captures the USP, the real difference that the technology, that the company being talked of can offer. And I'm very aware that organizations who do support this area and funders who support this area look for you to do the work for them. What you're trying to do is get those people in those organizations and funders to use their own internal capital to fight for your project. And you have to give them the tools to be able to do that. Narrative is all a part of that. You also need to look for the right funding, right projects, right time. That's something I say quite often. What I mean by that is venture capital right for you? Is the capital that's available from the utilities, if there is any anymore, is that right for you? You really need to ask and identify. Now, there's a great temptation when you're looking for funding to get it from wherever it's offered, and I understand that. But sometimes it's simply not right. The other thing I think you need to do is really thoroughly identify the risk that's in the project, in the business, in the technology. Really interrogate it, mitigate it, and make sure it ends up sitting in the right area. Bearing in mind that in my experience and in my personal opinion, banks and funds don't take risk. I think that's a very important point. You've got to bear in mind, I think, and understand targets, tariffs, policy framework. You need to understand those in the geographic area you're operating, where your project is, really understand them. And that really informs the narrative that you develop to deliver your project and to seek the funding. Innovative funding, that needs to come. And I think some of the developments that have happened post-MeyGen, sitting around things like which sat around the commission underwriting 95% of the first loss, allowing the EIB to effectively participate as an equity player. These were very important things, and to some extent, they came about because of the way MeyGen was funded. And the other thing, and I know Cameron is going to reference this in his contribution a little later, is that collaboration, in my view, is essential. Lessons from various other sectors really underline that. And I do not underestimate the challenges of achieving collaboration. There's always caution, there's always suspicion, and it is tricky. But nevertheless, I believe the benefits outweigh the risks. You need to create the right conditions for securing funding. And to create those conditions, you need to start early. Often, I've come across situations where those looking for funding start late. It's the last thing they think about. Actually, it should be the first thing they think about. You need a strategy. Your business, your company needs high-level values, and you need to stick with them, and you need to use them to inform decisions. Your strategy, your high-level values may sit around climate change, they may sit around other things, but I think you need to have those. You need to think about communications. It's really not good to have the best business and the best technology and not have people know about it. It's very hard to raise money about something that nobody has heard of. Now, some folks think differently. Some folks think that all publicity is bad, and people in this industry in particular have overpromised and underdelivered. And I agree with that latter statement. So there's a balance to be struck. Absolutely there is. There's no point in announcing something that's not worthy of announcement. But if you have something that's worthy of announcement, then announce it. And there are people around who can help you with that and help you make those decisions. You need to assess what you're actually good at, what your team is good at, and where the gaps are. And you need to properly address those gaps. So, for example, in the original closing for MeyGen, which we're using as reference, the MeyGen team, as it existed at that time, I would stress, was part of the diligence process. The skill sets that were available and the tasks that were going to come ahead, they were all compared. And investment was made on the basis of a development of that skill set. That will happen, so you need to prepare for that. As I said, in connection with the last slide, I referenced the tariffs, the policy framework, and the public funding, and what they are designed to achieve. And you really need to understand that. Because if you understand what they are designed to achieve, you can shape your project, you can shape your business, you can shape your ask so that it delivers all or most of those things, and that will enhance your prospects of getting funding. And you need to ensure that finance and funding is at the heart of what you do at every stage. So if you can design out £10, if you can design out £100, that's £10 or £100 less you've got to raise. So think carefully about everything you do and think about trying to reduce the amount of money you want to ask in a sensible way. You need robust recording of decisions from engineering to business decisions. I've been involved with a range of businesses all looking for funding, and some really, really good engineers who really know exactly what they're doing and why they got to where they got to and how they got there. But sometimes that's not recorded anywhere. And when you're going for funding, that's a big hindrance. So you need to make sure you've got good reasons, recorded reasons, for doing what you've done and for the process you've been on, the journey you've been on, if you will. The same applies to business decisions, of course. Those of you who've been through any sort of diligence process will know that those business decisions you come to, those board meetings, those sessions, there are board meetings, but they're informal, they're around the table, and most businesses in this area are relatively modest in size. You need to have that discipline. It's really hard to create records of board meetings that happened and you're doing it accurately, but it's hard to do it after the event. You need to look at the risks you've identified from an equity and banking perspective, not just from a technology perspective. If the project is not bankable, then you will have real difficulty raising debt. So make it bankable. Everything that you do, all the agreements, all of the documents, don't think, we'll get it signed now, we'll crack on, we'll solve that little problem later. That little problem will emerge under any diligence, and it will come back to bite you. And you need to engage early with those who are going to build this for you. I was very taken with this in February when I attended Tidal Conference down in London, and one of the presenters at one of the sessions was from a shipyard in the northeast of England. And he talked about sitting down with developers and suggesting alterations to simple specifications around steel and how much that saved. And I think that's part of the collaborative process that the industry needs to follow. You need to think very, very carefully about your pitch. There are people who can help you with pitching. And again, simply because I'm aware of it, Scottish Enterprise has a financial readiness team, and they will be delighted to hear from you and delighted to help you in preparing for your pitch. And they have a lot of experience. A lot of people go, they see a lot of people preparing for pitches, and they can give some real good help. You have a short problem in that you will not be used to pitching. You have a short time in somebody's office, you have to get the message across. And don't be tempted to do too much talking. Try and do some listening, try and be aware of body language. Be prepared to fail, be ready to succeed. Being ready to succeed means if you get traction and you are asked for follow-up documents, if it takes you 5 weeks to put those documents together, you will have lost the interest potentially of that potential investor. So you have to have those follow-up documents ready or just about ready. Finally, in terms of advice and thoughts that might help, I mentioned communities. I feel quite strongly that communities, in the widest sense, are ignored a little bit by the sector. I know various people have had differing experiences in dealing with communities, and I think that's part of the picture, part of the program. But what I can speak personally to is, even at the UK government level, and particularly with onshore wind and island wind, there are strong indicators that community involvement in such projects are a big help to getting funding. Communities also now have some experience in delivering renewable energy projects themselves, and some of them have money that's being generated from the projects, and they can be seen as potential investors as well. I know it's hard and it's difficult. I'm working with a developer now in a different sector who has agreed to involve the community right from first moment, and held a first community meeting and got very positive reaction, not only from the community, but also from those representing the agencies who work on behalf of the Scottish Government in delivering support. You need to really look hard at the material you're using to get the funding. And I know Mark Stewart is going to mention this in particular. But again, speaking just about the recent experience I've had in the last few weeks, where I've seen a number of teasers and a number of IMs and some business plans, I can speak to the fact that they are universally needing help. And I think that is something that has to be as good as it can be. You need to get the best financial model you can with sensitivities in it. And you need it reviewed. And again, I have direct experience in the last 4 weeks in this sector where some are poor and some are good. And finally, I think you need to use the very best advisors you can. There are people who will help you fund that, and potentially the economic intervention agencies may be able to assist or direct. Something that was said to me many, many years ago, if you think using professionals is expensive, wait until you've used amateurs. Okay, that's the slide pack finished. What I would encourage now is some questions and answers, and we'll do our best to come up with solutions to those questions we're able to review in the time left to us. Before we launch into the questions and answers, what I'd like to do is ask my colleagues, Cameron Smith from Atlantis and Mark Stewart from JCCA, just to say a few words about their involvement today and their thoughts. I'd like to hand over at this point, Cameron, to you to make some initial opening remarks.
Cool. Thank you, Andrew. I'm very conscious of the time. I know we've had 40 minutes of very interesting dialogue from yourself, John, but I'm conscious that we probably want to have a few minutes for questions at the end, so I'll keep it brief. But I sit in a very fortunate position of being able to advise everybody that we now have 3 of the Andritz Hammerfest hydro turbines deployed in the water due to the sterling efforts of our project and turbine engineering services teams supported by all our backroom staff. That means that MeyGen Phase 1A, and that's what we're talking about here, just to be clear, a lot of the slides refer to the post-MeyGen era. MeyGen itself is 398 megawatts and is going to go on for a long time, and it's going to deliver a great deal more for this industry in terms of cost reduction and generation. But in terms of Phase 1A, we've now done over 1.5 gigawatt-hour of energy generated, which is a huge achievement, I think a world first. We did over 700 megawatt hours in August, and the turbines are just quietly turning away, doing what they're supposed to do, out of sight and out of mind. It's a testament to our team's remarkable doggedness, but it's a huge testament also to the people that Andrew put on that slide in terms of their faith in this industry and their belief that it would work, and the fact that the Scottish Government, HIE, Crown Estate, ourselves, a number of other people put their hands in their pockets and supported this through the last 2 to 3 challenging years. So it's a great position for me to be sitting in. I can take no personal credit for it, but it's a fantastic achievement by our teams. And for those who are interested, I'll obviously give you some more pictures and facts at the Scottish Renewables Conference next week, and Tim will give you a chapter and verse, I can assure you, at the ITIS seminar in November. Andrew, you asked me just for a couple of pointers from offshore wind. I think 2 things to make from offshore wind. The first is, if you'd sat here 6 or 7 years ago and said, we're going to be doing offshore wind for under £100 a megawatt hour, everybody would have thought you were insane. And certainly nobody would have ever contemplated you be doing merchant offshore wind. So it's amazing what can change. Absolutely incredible what can happen when people collaborate, which is what happened in offshore wind, and compete, which is also what happened in offshore wind. So it's using collaboration in terms of working with government, consistency of policy, and using scale, driving out costs, driving contractual efficiencies, bringing in new supply chain, and it's straight competition when it comes to fighting to get prices down. So those 2 key elements need to be learned by this sector, because that's what delivered the cost reduction for offshore wind. I'd like to just quickly leave it there, because I know we're running out of time, and I'll maybe just let Paul take over.
So Paul, what I'd like to do now is just introduce Mark Stewart of Johnson Carmichael, just to make a few remarks and then deal with 1 or 2 of the questions that we have received by email. So Mark, over to you.
Thanks very much, Andrew, and likewise I'll be particularly brief, just to give a snapshot of where we sit in this space. So to start off with, I'm not a technology expert, and I'm certainly not a technology developer. But what I am is an expert in advising on infrastructure, and have been doing so for the last 20 years across a wide spectrum, and that includes PFI, PPP projects, ranging from sports stadia in Singapore, DLR extension in London, and most recently the Orkney Mental Health Hospital, involving bringing all stakeholders together. Within the renewable energy space, we've been responsible for delivering over £1 billion of fundraising, historically mostly in the onshore wind, hydro, and solar spaces, admittedly. And back to the community point, Andrew, we also advise Scottish Government on community engagement and how to get them involved in projects and really spread that value throughout communities. So what I'm looking forward to is bringing that expertise, that exposure to project finance to the marine and tidal sector, which frankly I think is in need of a bit of a fresh approach and fresh ideas, and bringing perhaps some financial robustness that's been missing. Echoing a comment you mentioned earlier, Andrew, I've seen so many teasers, IMs, financial models, business plans, which all reflect aspirations of technology developers. They don't necessarily reflect commercial reality, and we seem to go from startup to global domination in one go. And I think perhaps it needs to be a bit more focused, a bit more specific, and that may be a manifestation of not getting professionals involved up front, either because of budgetary constraints and the process is managed down. So I don't think the use of professionals up front is as effective as it can be. I think you need to get the right advice, professionalize the whole process, and your adage on professionals and amateurs is exactly spot on. You've got to remember too that taking these projects to the financing markets, you've got sophisticated people that want numbers that make sense. They want business plans that reflect IMs and vice versa, an integrated approach. So I'm delighted to be part of this webinar. I'll certainly be at the conference in due course, and look forward to getting involved as much as possible and really adding that financial rigor and robustness to the process.
Thanks very much, Mark. Much appreciated. And apologies, the actual presentation took up so much time. There's a couple of questions that have come in, quite a number actually, and I'm just looking for some themes in them. There are a few questions that sit around the patents and the value that they may add and the costs that may be incurred. And I have a few thoughts about that, and I would ask Cameron and Mark to come in from their perspective. But my own thoughts to start off are that patents can be a real blessing, and we've all seen the programs on BBC Two television in the UK, the Dragon's Den, where one of the questions they often ask is about patents. But they can be a double-edged sword, because once your patent is out there, it's public knowledge and it's challengeable. And very often, businesses simply don't have the funds to take on people that might infringe on their patents. So I think this is an area where some knowledge inside your business is a really good thing, and I think you need to think carefully about the things you do patent, and I think you need to think really carefully about the extent to which you patent. Again, in recent weeks I've been working on a project along with Johnson Carmichael, where a business has taken a decision to be very careful about the extent to which they patented something, so that challenges from bigger industries are avoided. And that particular business has taken separate advice on these matters. So I acknowledge it's difficult, and it's undoubtedly the case that if you have a good, strong patent, then investors will be a lot happier. But if you have a strategy developed around patenting, if you have reasons why you have and haven't patented things, and those reasons make sense, then that will be just as much of interest to investors. Cameron, do you have any thoughts about that? Mark, anything from your own experience on that?
I guess generally with all of these things, Andrew, it's differentiating value with commercial value, particularly around royalty income, license income that you're going to get from the exploitation of these patents in due course, and making sure that it's back to financial models and sensitivities, and to make sure that you've got some realistic challenge around the assumptions you're using, which drive the numbers and ultimately the business case. So I would just, again, it's back to professionalizing the whole process and making sure that you've got the right people helping out with those financial elements of the patent and the commercialization thereof.
Okay, I'm very grateful. I'm very conscious too that we're running right up against our deadline, and for those of you who've been kind enough to attend and to submit questions, I'm sorry we haven't got to those questions yet. What we will do is we'll have a record of those questions and to the extent we can, we will revert to you with answers over the next little while. Paul, I'd like to hand back to you at this time just to wrap up, if you will.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for tuning in, and sorry about the noise interference. It actually remains a mystery. There seemed to be a rogue speaker in our system, but we couldn't seem to mute it, so apologies for that. And I'm sure if you have any additional questions, Andrew will get in touch with you to answer them directly, or alternatively, you can meet him at ITES and yeah, meet him face to face. I'd like to take this occasion to thank Andrew and our speakers for being involved in today's session, and yeah, we'll look forward to seeing you in London. Thank you very much. Have a nice day. Bye.
Thank you.